I'm Neil Matthew Murphy, the youngest son of Cornelius Matthew Murphy of Chicago originally. He probably was the man about town selling typewriters for Underwood Typewriter Company in Green Bay, Wisconsin, until he met my mother and married my mother in 1915. So they were married, and my oldest brother was born in 1916, Father John C. Murphy, and Pat Sullivan, and then your mother, Kathleen, all both born in Green Bay. The two youngest, Joanne and I, were born in Milwaukee, but that's another story. He played sports, and again, in that era, with no television and other things, many people did their own athletics. They entertained themselves not only with athletics, but with cards and various things. I can remember back in Wisconsin as a kid, people played Michigan rummy and things like that, things they don't do anymore. They sit in front of the tube too often, I think. At any rate, he involved himself with sports at a team called the Ripmores in Chicago, and they were 135-pound champions of Chicago in '09, which would have made him 13 and 9, 22-year-old.
Very young man.
Yeah, and they had a team, and he was manager of it. And we've got pictures of '07, '08, and '09 of the Ripmores in Chicago. He was a player, and then he was the manager. Managerial seemed to be what he wanted to do. Maybe he wasn't that good of an athlete, I don't know. But he was a good manager, and a good typewriter salesman, and he was selling typewriters in Chicago and dealing with sports teams, be it baseball. He got to know Johnny Coulon, who was bantamweight champion of the world in 1911. And he formed a baseball team with Johnny Coulon. It was called the Coulons. And if you'll note one of those pictures, there's Johnny Coulon sitting in the middle. My dad up there is the manager, and all of them have Coulon across their chest. Anything for a team, I guess. In the end of World War I, people got interested they were coming home from the war and forming teams and doing the things, getting back to normal, Like it said in one of your sports books, Tim, it said that people were more interested in what baseball players were coming back from General Pershing's army in World War I than they were in pro football players at the time. It was not a big thing. Baseball was a big thing then. But these football players that were out of school, they'd like to make a buck and form a team and town team. And Curly Lambeau was back in town. Now, just briefly on his story, he was all city at East High School in Green Bay, Wisconsin. He was scholarship to Notre Dame under Newt Rockne. Played one freshman year behind George Gipp. And then he got tonsillitis. And at that time, I guess without the antibiotics and all, they sent him back to Green Bay. And maybe he didn't like college, whatever. He decided to marry his girlfriend and stay in Green Bay and look around for someplace to play football. He was an athlete, great athlete. And he then got together with George Calhoun and my dad. They were all friends. And George Calhoun was a sports writer for the Green Bay Press-Gazette. And he thought, well, okay, everybody's back. Let's get a team going. So he put an ad in the paper in 1919 in August. Said all those interested in forming a team in Green Bay show up at the editor's office of the Green Bay Press-Gazette on, I think it was August 14th, 1919. My dad went with Curly. Calhoun, being the sports writer, was there already. And all the young studs in town showed up to play football. They elected Curly captain because he was a team. He was the athlete. Calhoun would put in the papers when they were going to have a team against Racine, Wisconsin, or the Scales Company out of wherever, I can't think right now. He'd put the thing in the paper. It's going to be a big clash at Hagemeister Field and all that, and get people to come out. So they did okay in 1919. And my dad was manager. He took care of the scheduling of the teams, arranging with the managers of who would meet who and where on what dates. Kept charge of the money. They felt that, Curly felt that my dad was the one to handle cash in 1919 and 1920, as did members of the team. So basically, George Calhoun with the newspaper became what you would call today as a publicity director. Curly Lambeau as the best player and captain called the plays on the field. You couldn't call a play from the sidelines. On the field by the captain. And he was captain and star. The team was built around him. And my dad was on the sidelines, scheduling the games, getting the gate receipts. Business manager would be more like it. I mean, you think of a manager as maybe just handling equipment. Well, that's not what he did. He was the business manager of the team. And a lot of credit, because Curly Lambeau was very interested in promoting Curly Lambeau. In fact, he got a team name, the field named after him. Was often credited with founding the team, but it was founded, in my mind, more by the sports writer who said, why don't I put this in the newspaper, see who shows up? You know, run it up the flagpole, see what happens. And they showed up. If you read history of the Packers, you'll probably see that if it snowed on the morning of a game, the town people would show up with their shovels and shovel out the stadium so they'd have a game. Well, the same was true back in 1920 when they had to enclose the field to make that money. Calhoun, the sports writer in the paper, says, Manager Neil Murphy requests that the young men of Green Bay bring their hammers. The lumber has been donated and nails. Maurice Lambeau, Curly Lambeau's dad, is going to be the foreman. You just check in with Neil Murphy and he'll put you to work. And Calhoun put that in the paper enough days, and they come out on the weekend, the townspeople, anybody with a hammer that could pound a nail, and they built a fence around the field, and that made it financially viable. Once you can enclose it in a field, you don't have to pass the hat. You can charge admission. So that was absolutely essential. Everything has to have a financial backing. You know, without the financial backing, it's not going to make it. So I think that fence was very important. And my dad's putting it in the lease, a stipulation in the lease that he signed. Neil Murphy, manager, Green Bay Packers football team, signed the lease with Hagemeister Park, the realty company, with a stipulation to build a fence. Was thinking ahead, planning for when they could make some money at this game. They were financially successful in 1920 because of my dad and the fact that he put in the lease a condition that in order to lease the park for the sum of $100 for the season of 1920, from September to December, home games, that they were able to build a fence and charge admission. And with that, in 1919, the original year of the home team, each player made $16 for the fun of playing football. After my dad financially ran the team in 1920, they made $276 apiece and presented him with a diamond stick pin in appreciation. I think the media guide says that 1919 they got something like $15, $17 each. I mean, it was a pittance. And the next year, the dividing up among everyone, including, you know, everybody that had anything to do with the team, was $276, which was due to the fact that they were able to charge admission. Calhoun was obviously, as a publicity promoter for the team, would get the town interested in coming out and seeing the games. My dad organizing, Neil Murphy, my dad, organizing the teams that would come to town, and Curly Lambeau, being the all-star player that he was and captain on the field, were all forces that brought together what then was to become one of the most unique franchises in the history of the NFL. If they hadn't have been successful in that 1920 year, even though they had bankrupt years after that and had to sell stock to keep the team afloat, they would have folded. Basically, if you look in the record book, every team in 1919 and 1920 that they played is no longer in existence. The only team in existence in that they played in those years is the packing team. And all the other teams, the athletic clubs from Racine and Milwaukee and various places around the Midwest, are all history. And the Packers weathered that, and I think they weathered it basically because they had a good year in 1920. Which reminds me, he's passed away now, but a fellow named Jim Ford was a historian for the Packers and very attached to them. He wrote me, and every time he'd talk about 1920, he says, "Your dad was in a pivotal year of the history of the Packers. Without 1920, there would have been no 1921, no NFL, no Green Bay Packers, no Lambeau Field. Pivotal year." At that time, the teams were either sponsored by someone who wanted some advertising, like the Meat Packing Company, and they had bowling leagues and baseball teams and various things. They were interested in backing sports and their name on the jersey and sponsored. Or there were athletic clubs, Milwaukee Athletic Club and various places, but the Scales Company that made the scales in the grocery stores and so forth, they had a team. They were looking for every angle. And one of them was with St. Patrick's Church. I guess that they, under sponsorship of them, received some type of a tax exemption. I don't know how they worked that out, but it was a way to get the money in without having Uncle Sam get as much as he otherwise would. They figured a tax exemption. That was my dad's work. He was a businessman. Indian Packing Company lasted about 6 months, and they were taken over by the Acme Packing Company. So when you see the early pictures of the team in Green Bay, it'll say Acme on it, because that's the meat packing company that was most influential in the forming of the team. And it just became natural when George Calhoun would write articles in the paper about the team. He'd say the Packers, the meat packing team, did this or that. So with that, Packers stuck. People wonder where they got the name. That's where they got it, because they were the meat packing company, and Packers maybe packing the football, but no, the meat packing company. Curly more or less found some backing. He was a star. There's no two ways about it. Curly Lambeau was a fantastic athlete. And he then got the money together, the $50 and the money to go and meet with the other owners of various teams, the Staley Starch Company and what have you, and form the nucleus of the American Football Association, which then just gravitated into the NFL. So the years of 1919 and 1920, when it was a home team in Green Bay, playing home teams in Milwaukee and Racine and Beloit, that's what it amounted to. In 1921 was the first attempt to then form what then became the NFL. So a lot of the records don't show the years 1919 and 1920 because they were just a home team. They played local teams in Wisconsin and Illinois and on up to some in Minnesota. Riggy Dwyer was a member of the team, and he was in a train accident, and he lost, well, as I say, I'm not sure. In the team photo, it's quite obvious in the top row that the light jersey that's been inserted is Riggy Dwyer, because he was in the hospital. And I like this letter from the manager of the Fairbanks Morris Scale team in Beloit, because it shows really what the sportsmanship was all about. And it's to C.M. Murphy, manager of the Packers football team. We have been informed of a terrible accident which befell Mr. Dwyer of your club, in which he lost an arm and a leg. It had also been rumored that he died as the effects of the accidents, although we understand this is not authentic. However, the loss of an arm or leg is almost as bad as death itself, especially in the case of an athlete. We would express our sympathy to Mr. Dwyer and his relatives. We'll all remember Mr. Dwyer as a hard-fighting, clean football player, and we certainly regret the victim of an accident. I thought that was touching. Riggy was part of the team, and he'd be in the photograph. Now, in the hospital, Riggy writes a telegram to my dad. Says, Neil Murphy, to Neil Murphy, manager, Packers football team. Even the nurses are with you guys, so go get them. Riggy. Thought that was nice. I don't know who originally came up with the idea, but they decided it was such a horrible accident and all that they would play a benefit game for him. And so Calhoun played it up in the paper that we're having a benefit game for Riggy and make donations, come to the game, pay admission. All proceeds go to Riggy. And they had that game, and my sister Pat showed me a letter today that I had never seen before from the brother of Riggy Dwyer. Now, either he didn't feel he could compose it himself, or because of his injuries he couldn't write it, but it was a thank you to manager Neil Murphy for putting on the benefit and having that money go to Riggy. It was a nice gesture. Well, of course, I was a little bit miffed that they don't give a little credit to a town team of 1919 and 1920, because they were the Green Bay Packers. They were the packing company team. They weren't in the big league, they weren't in the NFL, but they were a team, and they were the predecessor. If it wasn't for them, there wouldn't be any Green Bay Packers. So they kind of give it the short treatment and go right to the NFL, which was 1921, when they signed a lease with the American Professional Football Association, the forerunner of the NFL of today, and all records start in 1921. And they give a somewhat short shrift to the 2 years when they were a town team. Maybe that's the way it's done, but since my dad was associated with the town team, I would naturally be more interested in that. And that's why I went ahead and got a nice photograph of my dad, contacted the manager of the atrium, sent him documents, and he wrote me back a letter. He says, if anybody's picture belongs in the Hall of Fame, his does. So he sent us back photographs of where it now appears in the Packer Hall of Fame. And again, I was inspired to get a hold of this thing by the fact we went back in a trip, and I thought, hey, I'm gonna push this thing a little bit. You know, it's ancient history to a lot of people, but it's our family. And it's C.M. Murphy's family when you get right down to it. All the Rileys, all the Sullivans, all the Murphys. All the Irish clan came from Cornelius Matthew Murphy, who was a sports figure back in the early days of the Green Bay Packers. And I thought his picture ought to be there, and by God, it's there now.